Some people believe the strongest connections begin with a conversation. I used to think the opposite. The deepest ones begin long before either person understands that anything has started. There's no dramatic moment, no obvious signal, no sentence that announces, this is the day everything changes. Instead, something almost invisible shifts. A glance lingers half a second longer than it should. A silence refuses to feel empty. A stranger somehow feels strangely familiar without earning that feeling through time. Most people ignore moments like that. I never could. Not because I'm romantic. Not because I search for meaning in ordinary things. Because I've spent most of my life watching what exists beneath what people choose to show. Words have never impressed me. Anyone can arrange words into something convincing. Anyone can learn the expressions that make them appear kind, intelligent, or trustworthy. But what people don't control, what escapes between the words, that's where I always look. The pauses, the hesitation before an answer, the expression that disappears before anyone notices it existed, the shift in someone's voice when they're trying not to reveal what they're feeling. That's the language I've trusted. And after years of listening to that language, something unexpected happened. I stopped expecting anyone else to understand it. Most people hear what is spoken. Very few hear what is withheld, so I adapted. I became quieter, not because I had less to say, because explaining myself started feeling unnecessary. It's exhausting, translating thoughts that were never designed to fit ordinary conversations. Eventually, you stop trying. You let people understand whatever version of you is easiest for them to carry. If they think you're distant, you let them. If they think you're difficult, you let them. If they mistake your silence for indifference, you let them believe that too. Correcting every misunderstanding costs more energy than it's worth, and not everyone deserves access to the truth behind your silence. So, I built a life where distance became natural, not loneliness. There's a difference. Loneliness is wanting people nearby. Distance is choosing peace over constant explanation. I became comfortable there. Comfortable enough that I stopped imagining anyone would ever reach beyond it. Not because they couldn't, because no one ever stayed long enough to notice there was anything beyond it in the first place. Everyone meets the version of you that exists on the surface. Very few remain long enough to realize it isn't the whole story. I accepted that. In some ways, I even preferred it. Because being misunderstood is strangely peaceful compared to being misunderstood after you've explained everything. At least silence protects your truth. Words often hand it away. Then you appeared, not loudly, not dramatically. If I'm honest, I can't even point to the exact moment I noticed you. That's what makes this difficult to explain. You weren't an interruption. You were a gradual realization, like a picture slowly coming into focus, until one day you realize it had been clear for much longer than you admitted. At first, nothing felt unusual. You spoke the way everyone speaks. You listened the way everyone listens. There was nothing obvious, nothing extraordinary, which is exactly why I almost overlooked it. The difference wasn't in what you did. It was in what you never tried to do. You never rushed to define me. You never searched for labels that would make me easier to understand. You never interrupted silence simply because silence made other people uncomfortable. You let moments exist exactly as they were. That sounds insignificant. It isn't. Most people fear stillness. They assume every pause is a problem waiting to be solved, so they fill it with opinions, with reassurance, with questions, with noise. You didn't, you allowed silence to breathe. And in doing that, you revealed something I hadn't expected. You weren't listening for words. You were listening for meaning. Those are not the same thing. Words are chosen. Meaning often escapes without permission. That's why people accidentally reveal themselves all the time. Not through what they say, through what they almost say, through what they avoid saying, through the emotion that quietly reshapes an ordinary sentence. Most people never notice. You noticed. Not once, not twice. Consistently. Enough times that coincidence slowly stopped being a reasonable explanation. That realization unsettled me more than I care to admit, because I've spent years making sure my inner world remained exactly that. Mine, not hidden out of fear, protected out of respect. Some things lose their meaning when they are interpreted carelessly. Some thoughts aren't fragile because they're weak, they're fragile because they're precise. A single wrong assumption can reshape them into something they were never meant to become. So I became selective, not about who entered my life, about who entered my understanding. Those are different doors. Many people meet you. Almost no one reaches the place where your thoughts begin before your words do. That's the place I guarded, carefully, quietly, without resentment. It simply wasn't meant for everyone. Then something impossible happened. You began responding to parts of me I hadn't introduced. Not because you guessed correctly. Not because you were lucky. Because, somehow, you were already standing close enough to notice them. That shouldn't have been possible. Recognition usually grows slowly. Brick by brick. Conversation by conversation. Memory by memory. Trust is supposed to take time. Understanding is supposed to require history. Yet somehow, our conversations carried the weight of history without actually containing any. That contradiction stayed with me. Long after each interaction ended, I found myself replaying ordinary moments, searching for what made them feel different. The words weren't extraordinary. The situations weren't remarkable. Nothing about them should have lingered, yet they did. Not emotionally, mentally, like unfinished equations refusing to leave my mind until every variable made sense. But the more I examined them, less they behaved like puzzles. They behaved like recognition. Not the recognition of a face, not the recognition of a memory. Something quieter. The recognition of a pattern that already existed before either of us noticed it. And that's what frightened me. Because patterns don't ask permission before they become part of your life. They simply reveal themselves. Usually after they've already begun changing you. I don't know when I stopped observing you as someone outside my world. I only know that one day, without realizing how it happened, you no longer felt separate from the questions I asked myself. And once someone reaches that place, distance stops working the way it used to. I told myself it was temporary, that whatever I was noticing would eventually settle into something ordinary, something I could explain with enough patience. The mind has a habit of creating significance where there is only repetition. I know that. I've seen people mistake familiarity for destiny, comfort for understanding, coincidence for meaning. I refused to become one of them. So, I watched, not you, myself. I paid attention to the places where my thinking began to change. I questioned every assumption before allowing it to become belief. If there was an illusion forming, I wanted to catch it before it convinced me it was real. But illusions eventually collapse. They become inconsistent. They contradict themselves. The details stop aligning. This never did. If anything, the opposite happened. The more distance I created, the clearer everything became. That's what confused me. Distance is supposed to weaken perception. It's supposed to blur details, soften certainty, make people feel like memories instead of realities. Yet every step backward seemed to sharpen what I thought I understood. It wasn't your presence that stayed with me. It was your consistencies. You remained exactly who you appeared to be, regardless of the situation. Most people change depending on who they're standing beside. They become louder around certain people, quieter around others, more confident when they're admired, more careful when they're challenged. Their personality shifts so subtly that they rarely notice it themselves. I've never judged them for that. Adaptation is human, but consistency is rare. It's difficult to remain the same person when the world keeps inviting different versions of you to appear. Some people spend an entire lifetime becoming reflections of the expectations around them. They lose the original version somewhere along the way. I think that's why authenticity has become so difficult to recognize. We're surrounded by performances that have lasted so long, they've become identities. Maybe that's why your presence felt different. There wasn't a performance to decode. There wasn't a carefully constructed image asking to be admired. There was simply you, uncomplicated in ways that made complexity unnecessary. That kind of honesty is unusual, not because people enjoy pretending, because most of them have forgotten where the pretending began. It becomes automatic after enough years. A survival instinct disguised its personality. I understood that, probably more than I wanted to. I've done it too, not through lies, through omission, by allowing only certain parts of myself to exist in public, not fake versions, incomplete ones. There's safety in being partially known. If people misunderstand a fragment, they haven't misunderstood all of you. The rest remains untouched. Untouched things survive longer. That's the philosophy I lived by. Then I noticed something I wasn't prepared for. Around UAB, wasn't deciding what to hide. There were still things I didn't say. But the decision wasn't coming from fear anymore. It came from timing. There is a difference. Fear says, if they know this, they'll leave. Timing says, when the moment arrives, they'll understand. I had never trusted timing before. I trusted control. Control felt reliable. Control prevented disappointment before it had the chance to exist. It created predictable outcomes. Predictable outcomes create emotional safety, or at least they create the illusion of it. Because the truth is, control doesn't protect your life. It only limits how deeply life can reach you. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. I began wondering how many meaningful experiences I had quietly walked away from. Not because they were wrong, but because they couldn't be controlled. How many people had I kept at a careful distance simply because uncertainty felt more dangerous than solitude? I don't know, maybe more than I realize. Maybe enough that it became part of who I believed I was. The strange thing about habits is that eventually they stop feeling like choices. They become identity. You stop saying, I choose distance. You begin saying, this is just who I am. Those are very different statements. One leaves room for change. The other quietly locks the door. I had locked that door years ago, without anger, without regret, just certainty, or what I believed was certainty. Then you arrived carrying questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Not directly. You never challenged my way of living. You never suggested I should be different. You simply existed in a way that made some of my old conclusions feel incomplete, not incorrect, incomplete. There's an important distinction there. Being proven wrong creates defensiveness. Discovering there was always more to understand creates humility. That's what this has been. A slow education, not about you, about myself. It's strange how another person can become a mirror without ever trying to reflect you. You never held anything in front of me. You never said, "Look at yourself." You didn't need to. Somehow your presence quietly illuminated parts of me that had remained in shadow, not because I hid them, but because I had grown so accustomed to them that I stopped noticing they existed. Perhaps that's what genuine encounters do. They don't change who you are overnight. They reveal what has been waiting beneath your certainty all along. I've spent years believing strength meant remaining unaffected, remaining steady, remaining impossible to move. But maybe I misunderstood strength. Maybe strength isn't measured by how little the world changes you. Maybe it's measured by your willingness to let the right experiences reshape you without losing yourself in the process. That possibility has followed me everywhere, not loudly, like a quiet thought returning whenever the noise fades. It appears in ordinary moments, while walking, while reading, while sitting in complete silence. Suddenly I find myself asking questions I never asked before, questions with no urgency attached to them, only honesty. Who was I before I convinced myself that distance was always safer? What parts of myself have been waiting for permission to exist? How much of my independence was genuine, and how much of it was simply the result of expecting too little from connection? I don't have answers yet. Maybe I don't need them immediately. Some truths aren't discovered by thinking harder. They're discovered by remaining present long enough for them to reveal themselves. I'm beginning to understand that, slowly, patiently, without forcing conclusions before they're ready. For the first time in a very long while, I don't feel the need to solve everything. I only feel the need to remain honest with what is unfolding. And perhaps that's the quietest transformation of all, because honesty has a way of changing your direction long before it changes your destination. I don't know exactly where this path leads. I only know I'm no longer pretending I don't see it. And once you've truly seen something, not imagined it, not wished for it, but seen it, you can't return to the comfort of looking away. Something inside you remembers, even when you try to forget. Especially when you try to forget. Maybe that's where I am now. Not searching, not resisting. Simply standing at the edge of an understanding that feels larger than the words I've been using to describe it. And for the first time, am allowing myself to believe that some things aren't meant to be explained before they're experienced. There was a time when I believed every meaningful decision had to begin with certainty. If I couldn't explain it, I wouldn't trust it. If I couldn't predict where it would lead, I wouldn't follow it. That philosophy kept my life remarkably stable. It also kept it remarkably small, not externally. From the outside, everything appeared complete. Responsibilities were handled. Goals were pursued. Conversations happened. Days passed exactly as they were supposed to. Nothing looked unfinished. But there's a difference between a life that's functioning and a life that's expanding. I, I didn't realize how long I'd been protecting the first while quietly abandoning the second. Expansion asks something stability never does. It asks you to become unfamiliar with yourself. That has always been the part I resisted. I know who I am when everything stays the same. I know how I think, how I respond, how I recover. I've spent years studying the architecture of my own mind until almost nothing inside it surprised me anymore. Predictability became comfort. Comfort slowly became identity. Then something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Quickly enough that I almost mistook it for imagination. I began noticing moments where my first instinct wasn't my only instinct anymore. A thought would appear, followed by another perspective that didn't replace it. It expanded it. The strange part wasn't that my thinking evolved, it was that the evolution carried a familiarity I couldn't explain, as if another way of seeing had always existed just beyond my awareness, waiting for the right moment to become visible. I've asked myself countless times whether this has anything to do with you. Maybe that's the wrong question. Perhaps the better question is whether meeting someone can awaken parts of you that were never asleep, only unnoticed, because that's what this feels like, not becoming someone new, remembering someone older than the version I learned to present to the world. There are versions of ourselves we create to survive. Then there are versions that existed before survival became necessary. I've started wondering which one I've been living as. The answer isn't as obvious as I once believed. Sometimes I think we've confused adaptation with authenticity. We spend so many years adjusting to expectations that eventually we forget what wasn't adjusted. The world applauds what is useful, it rewards what is understandable, it celebrates what fits neatly into categories. So naturally, we learn to become easier to explain. But people aren't built to be explained. They're built to be experienced. That's something I never truly understood until recently. Understanding someone's isn't collecting enough information to describe them. It's standing close enough that description becomes unnecessary. You don't reduce them to definitions. You recognize them through presence. That realization has changed the way I see almost everyone. I've started noticing how often people speak without saying what they mean, not because they're dishonest, because they've become fluent in protecting themselves. They answer the question they think is safest instead of the one they actually feel. They smile because sadness complicates conversations. They laugh because silence invites questions. They perform certainty because vulnerability feels expensive. I don't blame them. I've done all of those things. Maybe everyone has. Maybe growing up is simply learning which masks help us survive. But surviving and living have never been identical. One preserves you, the other transforms you. Transformation has always frightened me, not because change is painful, because irreversible change asks you to release versions of yourself that once kept you safe, even if you've outgrown them, even if they've become too small. There's grief in leaving behind identities that carried you through difficult seasons. No one talks about that. People celebrate becoming someone new. Rarely do they acknowledge the quiet farewell to who they used to be. I've been feeling that farewell more often lately, not toward my past, toward my certainty. The certainty that I understood exactly how my life was meant to unfold. The certainty that I needed complete control before allowing anything meaningful to enter. The certainty that distance would always protect more than it prevented. Those beliefs once felt permanent. Now they feel like foundations that served their purpose but were never meant to become prisons. It's strange how freedom sometimes begins with questioning the rules you wrote for yourself. No one imposed those rules on me. I created them, carefully, thoughtfully, for reasons that made perfect sense at the time. They weren't mistakes, they were solutions. The problem is that solutions can quietly become limitations when we continue using them long after the circumstances have changed. Maybe that's what's happening now. Maybe nothing external has changed as much as I imagine. Maybe what's changing is my willingness to admit that the person who created those rules is no longer the person living inside them. If that's true, then this isn't really about you. Not entirely. It's about what your presence revealed. You became the moment where my old explanations stopped being enough, not because you challenged them, because reality quietly did. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing your life still contains possibilities you never accounted for, not because you lacked intelligence, because life has always been larger than your ability to predict it. I'm finally beginning to respect that, not with excitement, with gratitude. Gratitude, that certainty, isn't the highest form of wisdom after all. Perhaps curiosity is. Curiosity leaves room for truth to arrive wearing unfamiliar clothes. Certainty often locks the door before truth even knocks. I've spent enough years believing I already understood the limits of my own heart. Enough years believing I knew exactly what kind of connections were possible. Enough years assuming that every meaningful encounter followed the same predictable pattern: time, trust, understanding, closeness. In that order, yet here I am, standing inside something that ignored the sequence entirely. Understanding arrived before explanation. Recognition appeared before familiarity. Presence carried more weight than history. None of it makes logical sense. Yet denying it would require pretending I haven't changed. And I have, not in obvious ways. The world probably wouldn't notice. My routines remain the same. My voice sounds the same. My habits still resemble the person I've always been. But internally, something has shifted so quietly that even I struggle to identify the exact moment it happened. Perhaps that's how the deepest transformations always occur. Not through explosions, through accumulation, one honest conversation, one meaningful silence, one unexpected realization, one quiet moment repeated often enough that eventually it becomes part of who you are. Looking back, I don't think there was ever a single turning point. There were only countless ordinary moments that refused to remain ordinary, each one placing another piece into a picture I wasn't trying to assemble, until eventually, picture began looking back at me. And for the first time in years, I didn't immediately search for a way to explain it. I simply allowed myself to see it, exactly as it was, without reducing it, without fearing it, without asking it to become smaller just so it could fit inside everything I already believed. Maybe that's what growth has been asking of me all along, not to become someone else, but to stop insisting that I already know every version of myself that is still waiting to be discovered. I used to believe every meaningful chapter had a clear ending, a sentence that explained everything, a moment where every unanswered question finally settled into certainty. Life has taught me something quieter than that. Some chapters don't end because they are finished. They end because you've become someone who no longer needs the same questions. Maybe that's where I am now. Not standing at the end of a story, standing at the edge of a different way of living. For so long, I believed understanding meant reaching a conclusion. Now I think understanding is something else entirely. It's learning to stand in front of truth without immediately trying to reshape it into something more comfortable. That's harder than it sounds. The mind wants labels. It wants certainty. It wants guarantees that nothing meaningful will be lost. But life has never made promises like that. It only offers moments, some brief, some unforgettable, some so quiet they don't seem important until years later, when you suddenly realize they altered the direction of everything. Perhaps this was always one of those moments, not because it arrived dramatically, because it arrived honestly. There was no performance, no attempt to become unforgettable, no effort to create significance where none existed. Whatever this became naturally. And maybe that's why it reached so deeply. The strongest things rarely announce themselves. Roots grow in silence. The sunrise doesn't ask the world to notice it. A heartbeat doesn't become meaningful because it's loud. Its importance comes from its consistency. Maybe people are the same. The ones who truly change us are rarely the ones trying to. They simply remain genuine long enough for our own walls to become unnecessary. Looking back, I realize I spent years protecting myself from being misunderstood. What I never considered was that constant protection also prevents genuine recognition. You cannot build walls that only keep the wrong people out. Walls don't recognize intention. They keep everyone at the same distance. Perhaps that's why I've been changing, not because I've become less careful, because I've become more honest. Honest enough to admit that not every risk deserves to be avoided. Some deserve to be lived. There's courage in walking away from what harms you. But there is another kind of courage people rarely speak about, the courage to remain present when something beautiful asks you to become vulnerable. That courage has always seemed impossible to me. Now it feels necessary, not because certainty finally arrived. It didn't. There are still questions, still unknowns, still futures I cannot predict. But maybe wisdom isn't waiting until uncertainty disappears. Maybe wisdom is learning which uncertainties are worth carrying. Some burdens make you smaller, others make you deeper. I've begun understanding the difference. For years, I believed my greatest strength was independence. Now I realize independence was only one chapter. The deeper strength is remaining completely yourself while allowing another person's existence to expand your understanding instead of threatening it. That isn't dependence. It isn't surrender. It isn't losing your identity. It's discovering that identity was never meant to be a closed room. It was always meant to be a place where truth could continue entering. You became part of that truth, not because I decided it, because reality quietly reached that conclusion before my mind did. I fought it at first. Then I questioned it. Then I observed it. Now AB simply recognize it. Recognition carries a strange kind of peace, not because every answer has arrived, because you finally stop arguing with what your own heart has known for longer than your thoughts were willing to admit. I've stopped I've stopped asking whether this should have happened. Life has never asked permission before changing anyone. It simply places certain people, certain moments, certain conversations in your path and waits, not to see whether you'll control them, to see whether you'll notice them. I almost didn't. That thought humbles me. How many extraordinary things pass through ordinary days unnoticed simply because we're too busy protecting ourselves from surprise? I don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want certainty at the cost of wonder. I don't want safety at the cost of sincerity. I don't want answers that require me to ignore what I've genuinely experienced. Whatever this becomes, whether it grows quietly over time, whether it remains exactly as it is, whether our paths continue side by side or eventually separate, none of that changes what has already happened. Some encounters don't exist to give you a destination. They exist to reveal a direction. You became that direction, not because you told me where to go, because meeting you reminded me that parts of myself were still waiting to be discovered. That realization is something no distance can erase, no silence can undo, no passage of time can rewrite. It has become part of the foundation beneath every thought that follows. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps not every profound connection needs immediate definition. Not every truth demands instant action. Some truths ask only one thing, that you honor them by refusing to pretend they never existed. I can do that, without exaggeration, without illusion, without making this larger than it is. Because what makes something meaningful isn't intensity, it's authenticity. And this has been authentic from the beginning. Not perfect, not predictable, simply real. So I won't chase certainty anymore. I won't force conclusions before they're ready. I won't reduce what I've learned just to make it easier to explain. Instead, it will carry it with the same quiet respect with which it arrived. If one day our paths continue together, I'll meet that future honestly. If they don't, I'll still be grateful that our lives intersected long enough to remind me that even the most carefully protected heart can still discover new ways to understand itself. Because in the end, this was never only about another person. It was about becoming aware of a version of myself that had been waiting patiently beneath years of certainty, silence, and carefully measured distance. And now that I've met that version, Abe, have no desire to become who I was before. Some people leave memories, some leave lessons, and a very rare few leave you standing face to face with yourself, seeing your own reflection with a clarity you never thought possible. Those are the encounters that quietly divide a life into two parts: the person you were before them, and the person you chose to become after. I know which side I'm standing on now, and for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of what comes next, because whatever tomorrow asks of me, I'll answer it honestly, not from fear, not from habit, but from the quiet certainty that the deepest transformations never begin with noise. They begin the moment you stop resisting the truth you've been carrying all along. And once that truth becomes part of you, there is no returning to the person who had not yet seen it. There is only one direction left: forward,